Keynesianism, Monetarism, and the Crisis of the State by Simon Clarke. Introduction. The challenge of monetarism. Over the past decade, Keynesian full employment policies have been abandoned in one country after another, to be replaced by monetarist policies that place a premium on price stability. The monetarist counter-revolution has not only abandoned the Keynesian commitment to full employment, but more fundamentally has challenged the Keynesian conception of the role of the state in the regulation of capitalism, returning to the pre-Keynesian emphasis on the primary role of money in the market. How are we to understand this development, and what is its significance? Monetarists would claim that their triumph simply reflects the failure of Keynesianism and the correctness of their point of view. A new sense of realism has replaced the Keynesian fantasy of universal plenty. A popular demand for freedom has arisen to challenge the tyranny of the state. Many Keynesians, by contrast, see monetarism as a reactionary throwback, a misguided academic theory that has been pressed by doctrinaire economists on bigoted and narrow-minded politicians. But to see monetarism as the triumph of either rationality or irrationality is to attribute too much coherence and too much power to theories that serve more to legitimate than to guide political practice. The ideas of monetarism are important, but their importance is ideological, in giving coherence and direction to political forces which have deeper roots. The most popular explanations for the rise of monetarism look for these roots in political developments. The triumph of monetarism is commonly explained by the political failures of the left that opened the way for the populist ideology of the New Right, manifested most dramatically in the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism. The appropriate response of the left is then supposed to be a political response, to regain the ideological initiative. The left has to develop a new politics and a new ideology that will address the popular hopes and fears to which the New Right speaks, and rebuild a united movement that will win the hearts and minds of the people. The problem with this approach is that the rise of monetarism cannot be explained in terms of purely political developments. Thatcherism and Reaganism are only variations on a theme that has been played around the world. Moreover, the rise of monetarism has not been specifically tied to the rise of the New Right. In Britain, it was under a Labour government, and most particularly from 1976, that monetarist policies began to be pursued and Keynesian objectives abandoned. Moreover, the turn to monetarism under Labour did not only involve a turn to monetarist economic policies and objectives. The Callaghan government, is that how you say it? Callaghan? I don't know, I guess I should be English. The Callaghan government played all the New Right tunes, however off-key, and attacked the trades unions, extolling the virtues of the family, pandering to racism, tightening the administration of Social Security, stressing its commitment to, quote, law and order, launching the, quote, great debate on education. Although in Britain, Thatcher replaced Callaghan in Southern Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, social democratic governments have taken it upon themselves to carry through the monetarist revolution in the guise of a, quote, politics of austerity, while social democratic parties around the world have capitulated to a, quote, new realism. Thus, monetarist policies have been forced on governments of very different political and ideological persuasions. Although policies that have in some cases been adopted only under the force of circumstances have in others been espoused enthusiastically. While social democratic governments submit to the power of money in the name of realism, right-wing governments proclaim its power as that of a moral principle. These differences are important, but to stress the distinctiveness of the variations is to ignore the underlying theme. The rise of monetarism cannot be explained in terms of contingent political developments, in terms of personalities and political factions of the left and the right, for these developments are systematic, to be observed throughout the capitalist world. These political developments express a deeper crisis of which they are themselves a part. An alternative set of explanations looks to the economic crisis to explain the rise of monetarism, seeing monetarism as a capitalist response to the crisis. There are two very different interpretations of the significance of monetarism along these lines. The first interpretation rests on an identification of Keynesianism with the interests of, quote, industrial capital, and monetarism with the interests of, quote, financial capital. Keynesian policies involve high levels of state expenditure in support of the productive sector of the economy, state intervention in financial markets to secure cheap credit for industry, and demand management to provide a growing market for industry, making possible a high and rising standard of living and of welfare provision for the mass of the population. Although such policies serve the general interest, as well as the particular interest of industrial capital, they do not serve the interest of bankers and financiers who seek high interest rates and the freedom to invest their money where they can achieve the highest returns without regard for the common good. Footnote. For an interpretation of Britain's economic decline from this point of view, see the work of Sidney Pollard, especially The Wasting of the British Economy. Geoffrey Ingham, Capitalism Divided, offers a sociological account. This has been a recurrent theme in New Left Review since Perry Anderson's manifesto, published soon after he took control of the journal, The Origins of the Present Crisis, in 1964. Devastatingly criticized by Edward Thompson, The Peculiarities of the English. Far more valuable than any of these accounts of supposed British exceptionalism, which cannot account for the global character of the crisis, is Keyes van der Pijl's Making of an Atlantic Ruling Class, which applies a similar analysis on a global scale. I have criticized the approach, particularly in relation to the analysis of South Africa, in Simon Clarke, Capital, Fractions of Capital, and the State, Capital and Class, Volume 5, 1982, blah, blah, blah. On this interpretation, the crisis of the 1970s arose because the interest of financial and industrial capital came into increasingly sharp conflict with one another, these conflicts coming to a head in the form of financial crises, as the freedom of mobility of financial capital threatened to undermine Keynesian industrial strategies. The rise of monetarism reflected the victory of financial over industrial capital. Bankers exploited their financial power and their privileged access to the state to force governments to adopt restrictive financial policies that restored financial stability and confidence, but at the expense of high interest rates and cuts in public expenditure that drove the economy into recession. The appropriate response of the left within such a framework is to reassert the virtues of Keynesianism within a strategy that subordinates financial interests to the interests of national industrial regeneration, exposing and confronting the narrow and unpatriotic self-interest of the bankers and financiers that hides behind the ideology and politics of monetarism. This explanation has a superficial plausibility. Oh, fuck it. I just saw that I have my coffee sitting here behind my water bottle, and I thought I left it in the other room. I was going to have to wait till I was done recording to have a swig. But swig I shall. This explanation has a superficial plausibility. The economic crisis of the 1970s, like those of previous decades, did indeed take the form of financial crises whose resolution sacrificed the real economy on the altar of money. However, on closer examination, the plausibility of the account soon breaks down. How could financial capital manage to impose policies which are so transparently against the national interest? In Keynesian industrial strategies, if Keynesian industrial strategies could really have succeeded, if Keynesian industrial strategies could subordinate financial capital to the state, why has government after government elected on manifesto commitments to such strategies of national regeneration capitulated and pursued monetarist policies? Why should ambitious politicians drive the economy into recession if they could so easily have adopted policies which would have brought prosperity and votes? Only the crudest of conspiracy theories could explain such pervasive irrationality. The problem underlying such an account is that there is no evidence that the supposedly sharp conflict of interest between, quote, financial and, quote, industrial capital actually exists. Industrial capital has no more interest than financial capital in the expansion of production for production's own sake. Both forms of capital are motivated by one concern: profit. Only a relatively small part of the capital, even of manufacturing companies, is tied up in plant and buildings required to carry on production, and even the apparent fixity and immobility of those assets proves illusory when production becomes unprofitable. On the other hand, a significant proportion of the assets commanded by the financial institutions takes the form of loans to and shares in manufacturing enterprises. Moreover, the financial institutions derive the bulk of their profits not from investment of their own capital, but from concentrating the savings and bank deposits of the mass of the population, so that they do not necessarily benefit from high interest rates, their profits depending primarily on commissions and on the difference between interest paid and profits received. The profitability of financial institutions depends on a high level of demand for their loans, which in turn depends on general capitalist prosperity. When the economy goes into a recession, so that there is surplus capital available, the financiers search ever more desperately for outlets for this capital, which is diverted into ever more speculative channels. But this diversion of capital, is not the cause of the shortage of funds for productive investment, but the consequence of the shortage of profitable opportunities. The very distinction between financial and industrial capital is becoming increasingly anachronistic, as accumulation on a world scale is dominated by multinational corporations, which take the form of financial holding companies, closely integrated with multinational banks and financial institutions, which move their capital freely between countries, between branches of production, and between productive and financial investments. It was these multinational corporations who closed plant, moved productive investment abroad, and diverted their funds into cash and into financial and speculative investment in the course of the crisis. Far from being the victims of the rise of monetarism, they were its driving force. The fundamental error underlying this influential approach is its misunderstanding of the power of money. The power of money is not the power of banks and financial institutions, although it is the power of the banks and financial institutions. It is the banks and financial institutions who wield the power of money. The power of money is the power of capital in its most abstract form. Thus, the conflict between the needs of the domestic economy and the interest of multinational capital is not a conflict between the interests of different fractions of capital, but between the interests of multinational capital and the needs of the mass of the population. The irrationality of monetarism is not the irrationality of economists and politicians. It is the irrationality of capitalism. The second kind of economic explanation of the crisis sees it not as a confrontation between, quote, industrial and, quote, financial capital, but between capital as a whole and the working class. There are two dominant versions of this approach. On one interpretation, the rising wages and high standards of welfare provision associated with the Keynesian welfare state represented a significant achievement of the working class, asserting its own interest against the interest of capital. In a period of boom, capital could afford the concessions required to finance the Keynesian welfare state, in the interest of political and industrial peace. However, the continued advance of the working class eventually encroached on capital's profitability and precipitated, or at least intensified, a crisis of profitability. Capital had therefore to reverse the gains of the post-war decades, cutting state expenditure and increasing unemployment in order to weaken the working class politically and industrially so as to restore profitability. Monetarism is the ideological mask that seeks to conceal this capitalist counteroffensive. The appropriate response of the left is a militant and determined counteroffensive to restore the gains of the post-war boom and to bring capital under social control. Footnote: the classic expression of this position in Britain was Andrew Glynn and Bob Sutcliffe, Workers, British Capitalism, and the Profit Squeeze. An alternative version stressed labor shortages as the source of both capital's weakness and the working class's strength. See Andrew Glynn and John Harrison, Britain's Economic Disaster. Its development in relation to the state stressed the contradiction between the, quote, legitimation and, quote, accumulation functions of the state, the fiscal crisis of the state precipitating a legitimation crisis. End of footnote. This approach has the merit of bringing the capitalist crisis and the class struggle to the fore. Unfortunately, it is much too simplistic. The rate of growth of wages and improvement in welfare provision in the post-war boom had little to do with the strength of the organized working class. Britain had probably the strongest and most militant working class, but consistently had the lowest rate of growth of wages and welfare spending. Rather than militancy being the cause of the profitability crisis, it is far more plausible to argue that the profitability crisis Rather than militancy being the cause of the profitability crisis, it is far more plausible to argue that militancy was the consequence, as workers' aspirations were increasingly frustrated by the inability of capitalism to deliver the goods. More importantly, the transition from Keynesianism to monetarism does not simply involve a rise in the rate of exploitation. Monetarism does not consist in a frontal assault on the working class, pushing the trenches back a few hundred yards like a Somme offensive, any more than Keynesianism represented an unequivocal advance of the working class. If things were so simple, the popularity of monetarism with the working class electorate would be inconceivable. Monetarism rather involves a fundamental restructuring of the relations between capital, the working class, and the state, involving not simply a shift in the balance of economic and political power, but a change in the form of the state and class relations, in which some elements of the working class gain at the expense of others. It is this observation that underlies the second approach, which sees the roots of monetarism in the capitalist crisis. In this case, the crisis is not simply a crisis of profitability. The crisis is a structural crisis, throwing the predominant institutional forms of regulation of capital accumulation into doubt. The crisis of profitability is not the result of a fall in the rate of exploitation, but of the growing barriers to accumulation presented by the exhaustion of the technological possibilities of the Third Industrial Revolution. It is therefore a crisis of the overaccumulation of capital in relation to the outlets for that capital's profitable employment. First, increasing industrial profits require the massive replacement of labor by machinery, which substantially increases the fixed cost of the enterprise. Second, there are limited opportunities for increasing productivity in the service sector, so that the latter acts as an increasing drag on profitability, whether services are publicly or privately provided. Third, accumulation in the metropolitan centers has run ahead of the supply of raw materials, and especially oil, leading to a sharp deterioration in their terms of international trade. The simplest version of this argument sees the class struggles that ensue from this profit squeeze primarily in economic terms. A more complex version of this analysis has recently come to prominence in the work of the French Regulation School. This approach interprets the Keynesian welfare state as one aspect of the systematic forms of regulation appropriate to a particular quote, regime of accumulation, characterized by the dominance of, quote, Fordist production, based on the rapid cheapening of consumption goods through assembly line production, with rising wages and welfare expenditure, conciliating the working class and providing capital with a growing market for its products. The crisis is then seen as a crisis of Fordist methods of production, which undermine the whole apparatus of Fordist regulation. The main question raised by this analysis is whether the ensuing crisis is some kind of terminal capitalist crisis, with monetarism representing the last desperate response of a doomed class, or whether capitalism is entering a new phase of post-Fordist accumulation in which monetarism represents the attempt to construct forms of regulation appropriate to a new regime of accumulation based on, quote, flexible specialization, end quote. The application of the microelectronics revolution to manufacture and to services, the, quote, commodification of public services, the, quote, Japanization of industrial relations, the globalization of accumulation under the dominance of the multinational companies, and a growing segmentation of the labor force based on the division between core and peripheral labor on a world scale. The main weakness of the regulation approach is that, despite its sophistication, it tends to degenerate into a structural functionalist reductionism in which the forms of regulation of accumulation are determined by the social form of the labor process and the structure of production. This weakness is most marked in the regulation approach's treatment of money in the state. The regulation school sees monetary disturbances not as an expression of the contradictory form of capitalist production, but only as a symptom of an underlying crisis in the regime of accumulation. The appropriate relationship between the various branches of production is established by the institutionalization of the regime of accumulation. Once such a relationship is established, the appropriate relationship between the various branches of production is established by the institutionalization of the regime of accumulation. Once such a relationship is established, the presumption seems to be that accumulation is confined within the limits of the market, as the allocation of investment is determined by the tendency of the equalization of the profit rate. As accumulation comes up against the barrier of existing technology, the introduction of new methods of production breaks down the existing relation between the branches of production. Monetary instability, in which money appears as an autonomous power, is a symptom of this breakdown in the regime of accumulation. With the reconstitution of the regime of accumulation, the regulatory role of money is once more subordinated to the institutional forms of the regime of accumulation. Thus, money is seen as an instrument of regulation that expresses the social and political relations of the regime of accumulation. However much the power of money can be institutionalized within and circumscribed by the social and political relations of a particular, quote, regime of accumulation, the power of money does not derive from the institutional forms in which money appears. The power of money appears. The power of money is the power of command over commodities, and in a capitalist society over labor power as a commodity. It is consequently the irreducible form, the most abstract embodiment of the social power of property. Money is correspondingly the foundation of the capitalist mode of production, which is a form of social production defined by the appropriation of labor on the basis of property. The subordination of civil society and the state to the autonomous power of money is not, therefore, merely a symptom of the breakdown of the regime of accumulation. The subordination of civil society and the state to the autonomous power of money is the permanent expression of the subordination of the economic, social, and political reproduction of capitalist society to the reproduction of the social power of capital. The treatment of the state in the regulation approach suffers from the same weakness as the analysis of money. The underlying model is one of successive phases of structural integration and structural disintegration of capital accumulation. In a phase of structural integration, sustained accumulation is possible within the framework of the appropriate forms of regulation. As accumulation comes up against the limits of profitability, within the regime of accumulation, capital seeks to develop new forms of production to increase the rate of exploitation. However, these new forms of production undermine the structural integration of the regime of accumulation. The phase of disintegration is a period in which the transformation of methods of production lays the foundation for a new regime of accumulation. However, the construction of such a regime cannot be accomplished solely through the market. Who the fuck's calling me? The phase of disintegration is a period in which the transformation of methods of production lays the foundation for a new regime of accumulation. However, the construction of such a regime cannot be accomplished solely through the market. The task of the state is to remedy this deficiency by sponsoring the restructuring of the regime of accumulation and associated forms of regulation, including those that are a part of the state itself, to establish the structural integration on the basis of which accumulation can be renewed. Thus, the state is no more an expression of the power of capital than is money. The state is merely the institution that ultimately secures the functional integration of the regime of accumulation as it imposes order onto chaos. The power of capital is diffused through the structure of the regime of accumulation, which is ultimately determined by the social form of production. Not surprisingly, this approach tends to lead to very pessimistic political conclusions in confining the class struggle within the developing structure of the regime of accumulation. The analysis of the state on the basis of the regulation approach has been developed primarily in Germany by Hirsch and Esser, who have proposed the concepts of the, quote, Fordist and, quote, neo-Fordist forms of the state, which define the modes of domination appropriate to the corresponding regimes of accumulation. One second. The analysis of the state on the basis of the regulation approach has been developed primarily in Germany by Hirsch and Esser, who have proposed the concepts of the, quote, Fordist and, quote, neo-Fordist forms of the state, which define the modes of domination appropriate to the corresponding regimes of accumulation. The crisis of Fordist accumulation is simultaneously a crisis of Fordist modes of domination. As capital accumulation undermines the social relations appropriate to previous forms of reproduction, it leads to monetary instability, a rise in industrial conflict, and the emergence of new, quote, new social movements. The state responds to social disintegration in the crisis by penetrating more deeply into civil society to restructure social relations into forms appropriate to the emerging form of the regime of accumulation. This, quote, statification of society in the crisis is expressed in the concept of the, quote, Fordist security state, which gives way to the, quote, neo-Fordist state, in which state regulation is achieved not through the Keynesian modes of political integration appropriate to Fordism, nor through the directly repressive mechanisms of the transitional phase, but through the state-regulated, quote, commodification of civil society. Monetarism does not involve a withdrawal of the state from economic regulation, but now offers highly differentiated and flexible forms of state regulation appropriate to the segmentation of the working class and the greater flexibility of production characteristic of neo-Fordist accumulation. The role of the class struggle is strictly limited within this framework. It cannot overcome the structural constraints imposed by the forms. It cannot overcome the structural constraints imposed by the form of accumulation. It can merely slow down or accelerate the restructuring of the regime of accumulation and modify the balance of class forces within the regime. The only available political strategy for the left is therefore to abandon the struggle to reconstruct outdated forms of regulation and political integration in order to seek a new accommodation with capital on the basis of the new forms of accumulation. The regulation approach is very valuable in drawing attention to the systematic character of the regulation of capital accumulation, relating the forms of regulation of capitalist production to the forms of regulation of accumulation by money and the state. However, the explanatory relationships proposed are very unclear, both theoretically and empirically. Thus, the approach has tended to produce impressionistic typologies of the structure of the regime of accumulation that lack any firm historical anchorage. Although the connections indicated by the regulation approach are very suggestive, it is not at all clear that the different aspects of a particular, quote, regime of accumulation can be so neatly tied together in a functional whole, nor that the directions of causality are as unambiguous as indicated in the model. Moreover, the structural functionalism of the approach leads it considerably to overemphasize the coherence and stability of the, quote, regime of accumulation in a period of sustained accumulation, and to exaggerate its disintegration and instability in a period of crisis, so that it loses sight of the continuities underlying the historical transformations of capitalist reproduction and of the capitalist state form. It is unable to grasp these continuities because it has no theory of money, and the state as the dual forms of capitalist power, nor any conception of the contradictory character of capitalist regulation that derives from the contradictory form of capitalist production. Money and the state. This book draws on the insights of all the approaches outlined above. My starting point is the belief that it is important to take the issues that divide monetarist and Keynesian seriously. Although monetarism and Keynesianism are undoubtedly ideological, even in their most abstract and theoretical forms, they conceal within themselves practical truths, however mystified the form in which they represent such truths. However, monetarism and Keynesianism are not populist ideologies so much as ideologies of the state, giving ideological coherence to the institutional framework and policy decisions of the state. The crisis of Keynesianism and the rise of monetarism did not express a popular ideological revolution, but a crisis of the policies and institutions of the Keynesian welfare state. The Keynesian ideology was discredited because Keynesian policies became increasingly unpopular. Monetarism assumed a, quote, hegemonic position because monetarist policies secured electoral endorsement. The crisis of the Keynesian state was itself the expression of a more fundamental crisis in the accumulation of capital. This crisis appears in the growing financial pressure faced by national governments as they attempt to maintain economic growth by expansionary Keynesian policies. However, the crisis did not express a conflict of interest between financial and productive capital, but a contradiction between the popular demands for rising incomes and employment, which could only be satisfied by the growth of production, and the capitalist need to subordinate production to profit. This contradiction was not simply a matter of a decline in the rate of profit, whether as a result of the, quote, tendency for the rate of profit to fall, or the growing strength of the working class, but of a structural crisis of accumulation. However, this structural crisis was not the result of the changing functional requirements of changes in the labor process, but of the tendency for capital accumulation to take the form of the overaccumulation and uneven development of capital. Moreover, the political and ideological crisis to which the crisis of overaccumulation gave rise, cannot be reduced to the unfolding of an economic or structural logic, but was determined by the development of the class struggle within the framework of particular social, political, and ideological forms. My criticisms of the approaches outlined above are not primarily empirical, but are essentially theoretical. The immediate theoretical problem raised by the debate between monetarism and Keynesianism is that of the relation between the power of money and the power of the state. The underlying theoretical problem is the more general problem of the relations between economics, politics, and ideology. All the approaches outlined above are unsatisfactory in the last analysis in offering a one-dimensional analysis of the crisis of Keynesianism and the rise of monetarism, seeing it alternatively as an ideological, political, or economic phenomenon, rather than offering an analysis that can grasp the complex relationship between these different dimensions of the historical process. My primary aim in this book is to develop a more adequate framework within which to grasp both the coherence and complexity of the relationship between economics, politics, and ideology in the crisis-ridden development of capitalism. The immediate origins of this book lay in my own earlier work on the analysis of ideology. My first book in the field prepared the methodological ground, rejecting the idealism of, quote, structuralist analysis in favor of a historical materialist approach to ideology. The present book develops out of my analysis of the ideological dimensions of political economy, marginalist economics, and modern sociology as social theories. However, the confrontation between Keynesianism and monetarism raises the more complex question of the political significance of economic ideology, which can only be addressed within the framework of a theory of money and the state. The theoretical framework of my argument draws primarily on two related strands of thought that have developed over the past 15 years, involving a re-examination of Marxist theories of money and the state. In Britain, these developments have taken place primarily through the Conference of Socialist Economists. The reconsideration of the Marxist theory of money arose out of a renewal of the debate around Marxist theory of value. The central theme of the debate was the distinctiveness of Marx's labor theory of value in relation to that of Ricardo. And the conclusion was that for Marx, value did not correspond to Ricardo's embodied labor, but to abstract labor that appeared in the form of money. This implied that the distinctiveness of Marx's theory lay not so much in the idea of labor as the source of value and surplus value, as in the idea of money as the most abstract form of capitalist property, so that the supreme social power through which social reproduction is subordinated to the reproduction of capital. The reconsideration of the theory of the state was sparked off by the German state derivation debate. However, the Conference of Socialist Economists debate also drew heavily on the reconsideration of Marx's theory of value to move away from the German debate, which was strongly influenced by the systems theory of Jürgen Habermas and Klaus Offa, and later embraced the structural functionalism of Nikos Poulantzas and the French regulation school. This divergence arose primarily because of the central substantive issues in the CSE debate, were rather different from those that motivated the French and German contributions. The CSE debate was stimulated particularly by Britain's entry into the EEC, which raised the fundamental question of the relationship between the internationalization of capital working class struggles, and the nation state. The debate then developed in relation to the issues of law and the state, raised by the growing recourse to the legal regulation of the working class through the 1970s, of the relation between money and the state, raised by the succession of financial crises confronted by labor governments, and the relation between the working class struggle and the state, raised by the growing conflicts around the form of the welfare state. All of these issues raised a question of the, quote, form of the state in relation to the, quote, forms of class struggle, and it was this question that brought the state debate into a close relationship with the value debate. Sorry, one second. Sorry. The theoretical conclusion of the CSE contribution was that we have to look behind the institutional separation of economics, law, and politics to see money, law, and the state as complementary economic, legal, and political forms of the power of capital. The underlying unity of these differentiated and complementary forms of capitalist class power was explained by Marx's theory of value, the three aspects being united in capitalist property, money representing the most abstract form of capital whose power is institutionalized in the law and enforced by the state. The methodological conclusion was to reject equally the dominant tendencies of the economistic Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals and the complexity of post-Marxist modernism, whose sophistication was no more than a mark of its superficiality, in favor of a view of Marxism as a theory of social forms. This interpretation drew particularly on Marx's Grundrisse and on various oppositional currents in the Marxist tradition to reaffirm Marx's famous dictum that, quote, men make their own history, but they do not make their own history just as men please. Men do not make history under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past, end quote. Marx in the 18th Brumaire. However, this approach was concerned to reject the interpretation of Marx's dictum in terms of the dualism of structure and process that marks sociological interpretations of Marx. The forms of capitalist domination cannot be theorized in structural functionalist terms because the functional imperatives are themselves generated by the forms of class struggle. Moreover, these forms express not the functional integration, but the profoundly contradictory character of the capitalist mode of production, so that their adequacy is always problematic, not only for the working class, but also for capital. Thus, the class struggle does not simply take place within these forms. The forms of capitalist domination are themselves the objects of class struggle. The forms of capitalist domination are themselves the object of class struggle, as capital and the working class confront them as barriers to their own social reproduction. Although the unity and complementarity of these differentiated forms can be articulated theoretically, their development is the outcome of a history of class struggle in and against the institutional forms of the capitalist mode of production, whose historical resolution is always provisional. The approach did not lead to a systematic theoretical and historical account of the development of the forms of capitalist domination, the participants in the debate being concerned more to analyze particular aspects of the contemporary crisis. In the meantime, there was a tendency to borrow the schematic typology of the French regulation school to fill the gap, despite an awareness of the theoretical weaknesses of the latter indicated above. Similarly, the gap left by the absence of a historically grounded analysis of capitalist crises was filled by relying on the, quote, law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, end quote, although a more adequate framework was offered by the theory of overaccumulation, which was developed in this context, particularly by Makoto Ito. Footnote: Makoto Ito, Value and Capital. Marx's own treatment of crisis is notoriously ambiguous. In general, Marxist crisis theories have been concerned to prove or disprove the inevitability of crisis within an equilibrium theory, based on Marx's reproduction schemes or his analysis of the law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, rather than exploring the historical dynamics of overaccumulation and crisis within the kind of disequilibrium theory that dominates Marx's own work. My own analysis of overaccumulation is similar to that of John Weeks in his article, Equilibrium, Uneven Development, and the Tendency of the Rate of Profit to Fall. In the absence of such an historically informed account, the, quote, form derivation approach has been accused of, quote, economism. The focus of such an accusation is the analysis of the relation between capital and the state, which has been a persistent problem faced by Marxist political theory. Although capitalists undoubtedly enjoy privileged access to state power, the capitalist character of the state certainly cannot be reduced to the political privileges of capitalists. However, the political representation of capitalist interests is only one of the forms through which the relationship between the social power of capital and the political power of the state is mediated. The social power of capital is not embodied in the person of the capitalist, but in the social power of money. The fundamental theoretical problem is, therefore, that of the relationship between the social power of money and the political power of the state. This is equally the fundamental political and ideological problem raised by the crisis of Keynesianism and the rise of monetarism, and is the underlying theme of this book. The relationship between the power of money and the power of the state has been a persistent theoretical, political, and ideological issue since the first emergence of commerce. However, the issue arose in its modern form as the penetration of capital into production subordinated social production to the rule of money and dissolved the social relations of authority and dependence that had hitherto been the basis of political power. The rise of capitalism precipitated a crisis in the political and ideological forms of the pre-capitalist state, which was resolved by the reconstitution of the state on the basis of the radical separation of the state from civil society and of the social power of money from the political power of the state. Although the crisis of the pre-capitalist state form came to a head most dramatically in the French Revolution, the reconstitution of the state was first achieved, less dramatically but more systematically, in Britain, where the erosion of pre-capitalist social relations by the penetration of capital was more complete. The construction of the liberal state form was articulated theoretically by classical political economy, which first systematically addressed the problem of the relationship between money and the state in its modern form, and which gave ideological coherence and political legitimacy to the emerging state form. The first two chapters of the book examine the rise of political economy and the construction of the liberal state form in Britain. Footnote. Although the focus is on Britain and the presentation is historical, the aim is to draw out the essential relationship from the mass of contingent historical events. In the first instance, the essential relationships are taken to be those articulated by classical political economy. However, the analysis is also informed by the advantages of hindsight and of comparative research, so that the presentation in these, as in subsequent chapters, emphasizes those aspects of the British experience and of political economy that seem to me to have a comparative significance and a contemporary resonance, although limitations of space have made it impossible to make more than gestural comparative references. Political economy legitimated the radical separation of the state from civil society on the basis of the adequacy of the market as the means by which all particular interests were subsumed under the general interest. The law of property, enforced by the state, was the means by which all members of society, capitalists and workers alike, were confined within the limits of the market, while money was merely the means of circulation, the rational instrument through which conflicting interests were reconciled. The subordination of civil society and the state to the anonymous rule of money and the law expressed not the rule of capital, but the rule of reason. Marx's critique of political economy began with his critique of its theory of money. For Marx, money was not merely the means of circulation, but also, in money's developed form, the independent form of value. The subordination of social production to the power of money gave rise to antagonistic social relations of production, in which the power of money confronted the direct producers in the form of capital, and in which social production was subordinated to the reproduction of capital. Money and the law were consequently the social forms through which civil society and the state were subordinated to the power of capital. In Chapter 4, I build on Marx's analysis of the contradictory form of commodity money and an interpretation of his account of the capitalist tendency to overaccumulation and crisis, to develop an analysis of the contradictory forms of credit money and of state money, and so of the limits of the monetary regulation of capitalist accumulation. In Chapter 5, I build on Marx's characterization of the liberal state form to address the question of the contradictory form and limits of the capitalist state, which derive from the contradiction between the class character and the national form of the capitalist state. The class character of the state, embodied in its liberal form, requires it to secure the reproduction of capital. The national form of the state requires it to express politically and ideologically the national interest against all particular interests. The reproduction of the state correspondingly requires it to resolve this contradiction. The contradiction appears to the state in the form of social and political aspirations of the working class, to which the state has to respond within the limits of its form, confining the working class within the form of the wage and the constitutional form of the state. The admission of the working class to the Constitution on a national basis increases the pressure on the state to secure the sustained accumulation of domestic productive capital. However, this constraint introduces a further contradiction between the national form of the state and the global character of capital accumulation. The remaining chapters of the book present an account of the development of the capitalist state form on the basis of the analysis of the contradictory forms of capital accumulation and the capitalist state. The capitalist state developed in the form of the nation-state, within a framework of nation-states, in the context of the accumulation of capital on a world scale. The accumulation of capital on a world scale and the interaction with other nation-states defines the broad context within which particular nation-states have developed. But the development of each nation-state has its own rhythm and its own harmonies and disharmonies that cannot be reduced to variations on a single theme. As in the earlier chapters, the focus of the account is the British state within the global context of overaccumulation and crisis. But again, The aim is neither to provide a historical account of the British state, nor to present the British example as an ideal type, but to draw out the theoretical, comparative, and contemporary significance of the British experience. Footnote. For this reason, I have not cluttered the book with extensive bibliographical references to give account of a spurious scholarly authority. Any originality lies not in the empirical detail, but in interpretation. Those familiar with the literature will recognize the iconoclastic elements of my interpretation, and the degree to which I have simplified complex issues, which I hope will not be mistaken for naivety. End of footnote. Chapter 6 explores the development of the institutional forms of industrial relations, social administration, and electoral representation through which the capitalist state sought to confine the aspirations of the working class within the limits of its liberal form, and in and against which the class struggle has subsequently developed. Chapter 7 explores the contradiction between the national form of the state and the global character of accumulation to analyze the rise of imperialism that culminated in war. Chapter 8 explores the unsuccessful interwar attempt to resolve the contradictions of the capitalist state form on the basis of the reconstruction of the liberal world order. Chapter 9 then turns to the ideological crisis to which this failure gave rise, a crisis that culminated in the Keynesian Revolution. Chapter 10 analyzes the foundations of the Keynesian welfare state in the period of post-war reconstruction and the early stages of the long boom. The Keynesian welfare state is presented as the culmination of the attempt to resolve the contradictions of the liberal state form, rather than as a radically new form of the state, based on the rationalization and generalization of the systems of industrial relations, social administration, and electoral representation within the framework of the liberal state form, and the liberalization of the world economic system. Chapter 11 then analyzes the crisis of Keynesianism as an expression of the underlying contradiction of the capitalist state form in the face of a global crisis of overaccumulation. This contradiction appeared as a conflict between the power of money and the power of the state, as the institutionalized forms of class collaboration increasingly appeared as a barrier to the accumulation of capital and the aspirations of the working class, and so took the form of a class struggle over the form of the state. The rise of monetarism expressed the provisional triumph of capital in this struggle as the subordination of the institutional forms of the Keynesian welfare state to the power of money The rise of monetarism expressed the provisional triumph of capital in this struggle as the subordination of the institutional forms of the Keynesian welfare state to the power of money confined the aspirations of the working class within the limits of capital.